Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating sociological essay that looks at what actually happens when we rely on a massive, distant central government to solve our local problems. We're going to take a deep dive into the fragility of civilization's guardrails, and we'll be asking a pretty tough structural question. What happens when the people who are the most insulated from societal collapse are the exact same people designing the systems meant to fix it? Let's get into it.
To kick things off, let's look at this really striking observation from researcher Rob Henderson. He points out that highly affluent individuals often preach this culture of total liberation, basically talking the 60s, while in their own personal lives, they rely heavily on the strict, traditional discipline of stable families and incredibly safe neighborhoods. They're walking the 50s. It's a massive core contradiction that we are exploring today, a whole class of people who question traditional societal guardrails precisely because they live so safely behind them.
So here is our game plan for today. First, we'll be defining luxury beliefs. Second, living local, voting central. Third, the meta-luxury belief. Fourth, the federal death spiral. And finally, number 5, the missing corrective.
All right, part 1. Let's get completely clear on what the source material actually means by luxury beliefs. Okay, so a luxury belief is not just someone being a hypocrite. It's actually a really dangerous asymmetry. Imagine holding a belief that gives you high social status, but costs you absolutely nothing if it goes wrong. The believer is totally insulated from the consequences of their own ideas. They can afford to be super relaxed about things like marriage, work ethic, or public order because their own lives are heavily protected by wealth, resources, and second chances. Meanwhile, the text argues it's the folks lower down the economic ladder who end up paying the very real and honestly often devastating costs of those relaxed standards.
But, the source points out that these beliefs aren't all created equal. They actually stack up into a hierarchy. At the very top are ideas that actively tear down essential societal guardrails. Things like weakening the family structure, diminishing personal responsibility, or just generally lowering societal standards. The essay argues that these are the exact crucial structures that ordinary people desperately need to survive simply because they literally cannot afford to buy private replacements for them once they're gone.
Moving on to part 2, living local, voting central. Let's really unpack this behavioral contradiction. Now, before we dig into that specific contradiction, we really need to wrap our heads around this concept, subsidiarity. It's basically the idea that responsibility should always start at the most local level possible. The individual, the family, the neighborhood, and it should only move upward to a centralized government when it's absolutely necessary. And what's super fascinating here is that the affluent practice subsidiarity almost instinctively in their private lives. When a problem hits, they immediately rely on dense, intimate, local networks to solve it right at home.
And boom, right here is where that asymmetry really shows up. Think about it. When a wealthy family's child struggles in school, they turn to private local solutions. They talk directly to the teacher, they hire a private tutor, or they literally just pack up and move to a better school district. It is highly personal, local action. But when they advocate for strangers who totally lack those private safety nets, their political imagination just leaps straight to centralized Washington bureaucracy. They live subsidiarity for themselves, for sure, but they strongly advocate for uniform, distant national programs for everybody else. The author calls this the luxury of abstraction. It's like one of the absolute biggest privileges of wealth is that you can just view social problems as mere statistics or demographic trends, rather than a flesh and blood neighbor in need. But here's the catch. A distant, centralized bureaucracy just cannot replicate the intimate local knowledge of a neighbor or a community coach. An administrative state is great at transferring funds, but it cannot supply human attachment. So the argument is that when the affluent vote for massive, distant systems, they are unknowingly stripping away vital human-level safety nets from the people who need them the most.
Which brings us to part 3, the meta-luxury belief. Let's see how this reliance on central power evolves into a whole ideology.
According to Henderson, this is the ultimate luxury belief. It's the unquestioned assumption that a massive, distant government in Washington should just be the default vehicle for solving all of our social and economic problems. Now, why is this considered the meta-belief? Well, because it protects all the other ones. It provides this totally false comfort that we can safely dismantle traditional norms and local structures under the illusion that a massive federal government will somehow magically swoop in and fix the resulting damage. But, as the text heavily argues, we are dealing with a massive false equivalency here. Federal interventions usually just treat measurable surface-level symptoms. I mean, simply transferring money is definitely not the same thing as recreating community trust, right? Funding a new government program absolutely does not restore a fractured neighborhood, and issuing a top-down mandate completely fails to rebuild organic, ground-level civic responsibility. Assuming that massive bureaucratic scale can somehow substitute for deep community ties completely misses the real institutional collapse happening at the local level.
All right, part 4. Let's look at what the text calls the federal death spiral and how this systemic failure actually cascades. There's this incredibly powerful metaphor used in the essay. Think of a giant forest canopy blocking out the sun. The smaller plants down below are forced to adapt to the shade, and they often grow a lot weaker because of it. Now, if you suddenly chop down that canopy, those weaker plants will absolutely struggle to survive. But, and this is the key point, their struggle doesn't mean the canopy was necessary in the first place. It means the canopy permanently altered and weakened how local life grew beneath it. The source argues the exact same thing happens when massive federal power constantly occupies local space. So let's step through how this structural feedback loop actually plays out. Step 1, Washington intervenes to solve a local problem. Step 2, because of that massive intervention, local institutions totally reorganize around those federal subsidies, causing local authority to weaken and just sort of atrophy. Step 3, those states and communities become entirely dependent on the center to function. And finally, step 4, that very dependency is then used as proof that only the federal government can act, which justifies even more centralization. It is literally a ratchet that only turns one way. And as all that responsibility keeps repeatedly shifting upward, the explainer notes we experience a keystone collapse. Subsidiarity is basically yanked out like a keystone species from an ecosystem. Because local initiative fades away, simple disagreements that used to just let different towns choose different paths suddenly turn incredibly toxic. They transform into these high-stakes, existential, winner-take-all battles for control of a single national center. It's why every election starts to feel like life or death. The prize of total central control has simply grown way too large. Finally, part 5, the missing corrective. Let's talk about the architecture of constraint. This leads into a really fascinating and frankly provocative premise from political theory. We really have to ask ourselves, how does power actually behave when it faces absolutely zero consequence for failure? Think about it. In business, a bad company loses customers. A bad school loses students. They are disciplined because you can leave. But what actually limits a central government when the states and communities beneath it have no legal mechanism whatsoever to exit the arrangement? Now, just to be super clear here, the source isn't arguing that we should break up the country. Not at all. Instead, it's exploring this political theory about the architecture of constraint. Without the genuine threat of exit, a central government completely loses its ultimate mechanism of self-correction. Competition is what disciplines power. When an authority knows for a fact that you cannot leave, it doesn't have to persuade you anymore. It can just command you. The argument here is that this lack of constraint is exactly why centralized power tends to just feed on crises rather than actually solving them. So I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought from the essay. Maybe the absolute ultimate luxury is genuinely believing that a centralized institution, one caught in a permanent death spiral of power and dependency, can somehow magically rescue a society that willfully dismantled its own local guardrails. What really happens to a society when the people most insulated from failure are the very ones designing a centralized system that the rest of the population literally cannot escape? It's a profound structural question, and one that absolutely forces us to look closely at the true cost of our beliefs. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.